23 years of silence. 23 years of carefully constructed lies. 23 years of watching my daughter grow up, believing her father was nothing more than a deadbeat who abandoned his family. But sometimes, the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, and on the most important day of Madison's life, everything I had worked so hard to keep hidden was about to be revealed in front of 300 people. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of June 8th started like any other day, except it wasn't. Madison Rodriguez was graduating from Westfield High School, and despite everything that had happened between her mother Carmen and me, I wasn't going to miss it. I had been planning this moment for months, carefully coordinating with the school administration while making sure Carmen remained completely unaware of my involvement. I arrived at the school parking lot 30 minutes before the ceremony, deliberately choosing a spot near the back where I could observe without being noticed. Through my rearview mirror, I watched families streaming toward the auditorium. Proud parents carrying flowers, grandparents with cameras, siblings reluctantly dressed in their best clothes. Everyone seemed to belong to someone, to have their place in this celebration. Everyone except me. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I spotted Carmen's familiar silver Honda pulling into a space near the front entrance. She stepped out wearing a navy blue dress I'd never seen before, her dark hair styled in a way that made her look younger than her 41 years. Behind her emerged her husband of 15 years, Robert Chen, straightening his tie with the kind of casual confidence that had always made me feel inadequate during our brief encounters at Madison's elementary school events, years ago. But it was seeing Madison that nearly broke my resolve. She wasn't with them, she was probably already inside with her graduating class. But I could picture her perfectly. The last time I had seen her up close was at her middle school science fair 3 years ago, where I had watched from the back of the gymnasium as she explained her project on renewable energy to a panel of judges. She had inherited Carmen's determination and intelligence, but there was something in her posture, in the way she gestured when she spoke, that reminded me so much of myself at that age. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Major Daniel Rodriguez of the United States Army, a man who had led soldiers through combat zones in Afghanistan and Iraq, a man who had been decorated for valor under fire, sitting in a parking lot afraid to face his own daughter's graduation ceremony. But this fear was different from anything I had experienced in 22 years of military service. This was the fear of rejection, of disappointment, of having to explain 23 years of absence with nothing but good intentions and classified missions to show for it. I checked my watch, 1:45 p.m. The ceremony would begin at 2:00 p.m. sharp. Principal Margaret Foster had assured me during our phone conversation last week that everything was arranged exactly as I had requested. She had been surprisingly understanding when I explained the situation. Though I suspected she had dealt with similar family complications before. Westfield High had a significant military community, and she understood the unique challenges that came with parents in classified positions. The walk from my car to the auditorium felt longer than any march I had ever completed in the Army. I had changed out of my uniform and into civilian clothes, a simple black suit that I hoped would help me blend into the crowd. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention to myself before the right moment. This day belonged to Madison, and I was determined not to overshadow her achievement with my own drama. Inside the auditorium, I found my reserved seat, in the back row, Section M. Principal Foster had been very specific about the location, close enough to have a clear view of the stage, but far enough from Carmen's family to avoid any premature confrontations. I scanned the crowd until I located them in the third row, center section. Carmen was talking animatedly with Robert, both of them occasionally glancing toward the stage where the graduating class would soon make their entrance. The auditorium gradually filled with the excited chatter of families and friends. I recognized several faces from Madison's childhood, neighbors from our old street, parents from her soccer team, teachers from her elementary school. It struck me how many people had been part of her life while I remained a carefully hidden secret. Carmen had done an excellent job of creating a complete world for our daughter, one that functioned perfectly without any acknowledgement of my existence. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the lights dimmed, and the traditional graduation march began to play. The graduating class of 2024 entered in alphabetical order, their royal blue caps and gowns creating a sea of color as they filled the first 10 rows of the auditorium. I found Madison immediately. She was in the R section, walking with the same confident stride I remembered from her childhood. She had grown taller since I last saw her, and her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders beneath her graduation cap. As she took her seat, she turned slightly to wave at her family in the third row. Carmen waved back enthusiastically, and Robert gave her a thumbs up. The smile on Madison's face was radiant, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would feel like to be the recipient of that smile, to be acknowledged as part of this moment, instead of observing it from the shadow. Principal Foster took the podium and began her opening remarks about the class of 2024's achievements. She spoke about their resilience during the challenging years of remote learning, their community service projects, and their acceptance rates to colleges and universities across the country. Madison, she mentioned, had been accepted to Stanford University with a full academic scholarship to study environmental engineering. The pride I felt hearing about my daughter's accomplishments was immediately tempered by the realization of how much I had missed. I knew nothing about her college applications, her career interests, or her academic achievements beyond what I could gather from careful internet searches and the occasional update from mutual acquaintances, who didn't know they were providing intelligence to her absent father. As the ceremony progressed through the standard graduation speeches, valedictorian, salutatorian, student council president, I found myself studying Carmen's profile. She looked genuinely happy, genuinely proud, and genuinely complete. The family unit she had built with Robert seemed solid and functional. Madison clearly adored her stepfather, and he appeared to reciprocate that affection with genuine warmth. Part of me wondered if I was making a terrible mistake by disrupting what seemed to be a perfectly content family dynamic. But then, I remembered the phone call I had received 6 months ago from Madison herself. She had tracked down my contact information through military channels, a process that couldn't have been easy for an 18-year-old civilian. Her voice had been shaky, but determined, as she asked me a single question: "Are you really my father, or is that just something Mom made up to explain why she was a single parent when I was little?" That conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had changed everything. Madison deserved to know the truth about why I had been absent from her life, and more importantly, she deserved to know that my absence had nothing to do with not wanting her and everything to do with protecting her from the dangerous reality of my work. The award ceremony portion of the graduation was beginning, and I knew my moment was approaching. Principal Foster had explained that she would announce my presence as part of the special recognition segment, just before the diploma ceremony began. My hands were sweating, and I realized that I was more nervous about the next 10 minutes than I had been about any combat mission in my military career. Carmen had no idea what was about to happen. Madison knew I would be there, but she didn't know how public Principal Foster intended to make my appearance. And Robert was about to discover that the family he thought he knew had been built on a foundation of carefully maintained secret. Principal Foster adjusted her microphone and cleared her throat, signaling the transition to the special recognition segment. The auditorium settled into an expectant quiet, the kind that precedes moments everyone knows will be memorable. I felt my pulse quicken as she began speaking about the importance of honoring those who serve the community in various capacities. "Before we begin our diploma ceremony," she announced, "I'd like to take a moment to recognize some very special individuals who have contributed to our students' lives in ways that often go unacknowledged." Her eyes briefly found mine in the back row, and she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Education doesn't happen in isolation. It requires a community of support, sometimes from people we see every day, and sometimes from those whose service requires them to remain in the shadow. Carmen shifted in her seat, probably wondering why the principal was drawing out what was usually a brief transition. Robert checked his phone, and several other parents began whispering among themselves. The graduating students, however, remained perfectly still, trained by months of rehearsal to wait patiently through administrative speeches. Today we have with us someone who has spent the last 23 years serving our country in some of the most dangerous and classified operations around the world, Principal Foster continued. His service has required enormous personal sacrifice, including the most difficult sacrifice any parent can make, missing out on watching his child grow up to protect not just his family, but all of our families from threats we may never fully understand. I watched Carmen's posture change. She sat up straighter, her head tilting slightly as if she was trying to process what she was hearing. A few seats away, I could see Madison turning in her chair, scanning the audience with wide eyes. She knew I was there, but the public nature of this announcement was clearly more than she had expected. Ladies and gentlemen, graduating students, please join me in welcoming Major Daniel Rodriguez, United States Army Special Operations, father of our Stanford-bound graduate Madison Rodriguez. The auditorium erupted in applause, but all I could focus on was the expression on Carmen's face. 23 years of carefully controlled emotions crumbled in an instant. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears, and she turned to look directly at me, for the first time in over 2 decades. Robert's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like understanding mixed with concern. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady despite years of military training that had prepared me for far more challenging situations. The walk down the aisle toward the stage felt surreal, like moving through water. Faces turned toward me as I passed, some curious, some respectful, others clearly trying to piece together the family drama that was unfolding before their eyes. Madison had risen from her seat among the graduates and was watching my approach with tears streaming down her cheek. This was the moment I had imagined countless times during long nights in Afghanistan, during classified missions I couldn't discuss, during the endless years of wondering if I was making the right choice by staying away. But nothing I had imagined had prepared me for the reality of seeing my daughter's face, after so many years of distance. Principal Foster met me at the bottom of the stage steps and handed me a microphone. Major Rodriguez has asked to say a few words to his daughter and to all of you, she announced, stepping back to give me the platform. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I looked out at the sea of faces, but my eyes kept returning to Madison. She had grown into a beautiful young woman, but more importantly, she had grown into someone with strength and intelligence that I could see even from a distance. Carmen had done an extraordinary job raising her, and I needed to acknowledge that before anything else. Madison, I began, my voice carrying across the silent auditorium, 23 years ago, your mother made one of the hardest decisions any parent can make. She chose to let you grow up believing that your father wasn't part of your life because he didn't want to be, rather than tell you the truth, that he couldn't be because his presence would have put you in constant danger. Carmen was openly crying now, and Robert had his arm around her shoulders. Several other parents were wiping their eyes, and I realized that many military families in the audience probably understood exactly what I was talking about. Your mother knew that my work with Army Special Operations meant that enemies of our country would target anyone close to me. She knew that having my name on your birth certificate, having family photos with me in them, having any public connection to me at all would make you a target for people who wanted to hurt America by hurting American soldiers' families. Madison nodded, tears still flowing, but I could see understanding in her eyes. We had talked about this briefly during our phone conversation, but hearing it explained publicly seemed to give it a weight and reality that our private conversation hadn't achieved. So she created a complete life for you, I continued, with a community that loved you, teachers who supported you, and eventually a stepfather who has clearly been the father you deserve to have every day. I looked directly at Robert, who seemed surprised to be acknowledged. Robert, I want to thank you for being the man I couldn't be, for being at every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every moment when Madison needed a dad. You've raised an incredible young woman. The applause that followed was different from the initial welcome. It was warmer, more personal, Filled with recognition of the complex emotions everyone was witnessing, Robert wiped his own eyes and nodded toward me with what looked like respect. Madison, I know this is your day, and I don't want to take anything away from your achievement. Getting into Stanford with a full academic scholarship while maintaining the kindness and strength I can see in you, that's all you and your mom and Robert. But I wanted you to know, in front of everyone who loves you, that not a single day has passed in 23 years when you weren't my first thought in the morning, and my last thought at night. I paused, looking around the auditorium at all the faces watching this reunion unfold. I know some of you are probably wondering why I chose to reveal myself today, after so many years of staying hidden. 6 months ago, Madison found a way to contact me. She asked me a question that broke my heart. She wanted to know if I was really her father, or if that was just a story her mother had made up to explain why she was a single parent. The auditorium was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word. Even the typical shuffling and coughing that accompanies large gatherings had stopped. That question made me realize that protecting Madison from physical threats was no longer worth protecting her from the emotional pain of not knowing the truth. She's 18 now. She's going to Stanford. She's smart enough and strong enough to understand the complexities of the world we live in, and she deserves to know that she has a father who has loved her every single day of her life, even if he couldn't show it. I handed the microphone back to Principal Foster and walked directly to Madison's row. The other graduates moved aside to let me through, and then I was standing in front of my daughter for the first time since she was a toddler. She threw her arms around me without hesitation, and 23 years of separation melted away in that embrace. The auditorium exploded in applause again, but I barely heard it. All I could focus on was the feeling of my daughter in my arms, the reality that she was real and grown and brilliant, and that somehow, despite everything, she didn't hate me for the choices I had made. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but it contained years of unspoken conversations, missed birthdays, and dreams deferred. When Madison finally stepped back, her eyes were bright with tears but also with questions. Before either of us could speak, Principal Foster gently reclaimed the microphone. I think we can all agree that this is exactly the kind of moment that makes graduation ceremonies truly special, she said, her own voice thick with emotion. Major Rodriguez, we're honored to have you here today. Now let's continue celebrating these remarkable graduates. As I made my way back to my seat, the dynamics in the auditorium had completely shifted. What had started as a routine graduation ceremony had become something far more intimate and complex. Parents were whispering to each other, many wiping away tears, and several military families were nodding at me with understanding. But my focus remained on Carmen, who was still staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The diploma ceremony proceeded, but the atmosphere was charged with emotional undercurrents. When Madison's name was called, Madison, Elena Rodriguez, the applause was thunderous. She walked across the stage with perfect composure, accepted her diploma from the school board president, and paused for the traditional photo. But instead of the standard smile toward the audience, she looked directly at 3 specific spots, first at Carmen and Robert, then at me, acknowledging all of us as her family. After the ceremony concluded with the traditional cap toss, families began the chaotic process of finding their graduates in the crowd. I hung back, unsure of the protocol for this situation. 23 years of absence doesn't come with an instruction manual for reintegration. Should I approach Carmen first? Wait for Madison to find me? Leave and let them process what had just happened? The decision was made for me when Robert appeared at my side. Up close, he was smaller than I had expected, maybe 5'8", with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He extended his hand with a directness that I immediately respected. Major Rodriguez, he said, I'm Robert Chen. I think we need to talk. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. It was the tone of a man who had just discovered that his family's foundation was more complicated than he had realized, and who was trying to figure out how to protect the people he loved while navigating completely uncharted territory. I'd like that, I replied, shaking his hand. And please call me Daniel. I think we're past the point of formal titles. Carmen is, well, she's overwhelmed, Robert continued, glancing back toward where his wife was surrounded by other parents offering congratulations and support. This is a lot to process. For all of us. Before I could respond, Madison appeared beside us, having somehow navigated through the crowd of celebrating families. She had removed her graduation cap, and her long dark hair framed a face that was so clearly a combination of Carmen's features and my own that it was almost startling. "Dad," she said, and the word hit me like a physical blow. Not Major Rodriguez, not Daniel, but Dad. 23 years of absence, and she was claiming me with that single syllable. "Hi, sweetheart," I managed, my military composure finally cracking completely. "Mom wants to see you," Madison said, looking between Robert and me. "But she's pretty shaken up. This isn't how she imagined this day going." Robert nodded. "We should probably find somewhere more private to talk. The parking lot isn't really the place for this conversation. There's a coffee shop about 2 blocks from here," Madison suggested. "Bennett's Cafe. It's usually pretty quiet in the afternoon." As we made our way through the thinning crowd toward Carmen, I caught fragments of conversations around us. "Did you know about this? That poor woman, keeping that secret for so long. Can you imagine having to make that choice?" The whispers weren't malicious, but they were constant, and I realized that what had felt like a private family moment to me had been a very public revelation for everyone else. Carmen was standing near the auditorium entrance, accepting congratulations from other parents, while clearly trying to maintain her composure. When she saw our small group approaching, she excused herself from the conversation and walked toward us with the same determined stride I remembered from our college days. "Daniel," she said simply, and 23 years of separation collapsed into that single word. She looked older, of course, but not in a way that suggested hardship or regret. She looked like a woman who had lived fully, who had made difficult choices and found peace with them. "Carmen," I replied, and then we were both silent. Two people who had once planned a life together standing in a high school parking lot, trying to figure out how to have a conversation that should have happened decades ago. "Bennett's Cafe," Madison said firmly, taking charge of the situation with the kind of leadership that reminded me why she had gotten into Stanford. "We're all going to sit down like adults and figure this out." The walk to the cafe was surreal. Madison walked between Carmen and me, with Robert slightly behind us, like some kind of awkward family parade. Other families from the graduation were scattered along the same route, heading to their own celebration dinners, and several people nodded or waved as we passed. The secret that had defined our family for over 2 decades was now public knowledge in our community, and there was no going back. Bennett's Cafe was indeed quiet, with only a few other customers scattered among the mismatched tables and chairs. We chose a corner table that offered some privacy, and for a moment, nobody spoke. The barista, a teenager who had probably graduated from Westfield himself a few years earlier, took our orders with the kind of studied indifference that suggested he either hadn't been at the ceremony or was politely pretending not to recognize us. Carmen spoke first. "I never thought this day would come," she said, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like it was anchoring her to reality. "I mean, I always wondered if Madison would find you eventually, but I thought you would handle it differently. I'm sorry if the public announcement caught you off guard," I said. Principal Foster suggested it would be better than trying to explain everything after the fact. "I didn't realize how dramatic it would be." "Dramatic?" Carmen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Daniel, you just told 300 people that I've been lying about our daughter's father for her entire life. Dramatic doesn't begin to cover it." Robert reached over and took Carmen's hand, a gesture that was clearly automatic after 15 years of marriage. "I think what Carmen is trying to say is that we need to understand what happens next. This can't just be a one-time reunion. Madison is going to college in the fall, but she's still our daughter." "Your daughter. And we need to figure out how that works." Madison leaned forward, her expression serious. "Actually, I think I should explain something that might change how we're thinking about this." She looked at each of us in turn, and I could see Carmen in her careful deliberation, but also something else, a directness that I recognized as my own. When I contacted Dad 6 months ago, it wasn't just because I was curious about who my biological father was, she said. I've been accepted to Stanford. Yes, but I've also been accepted to West Point. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's face went white, and Robert's grip on her hand tightened visibly. Madison, what are you talking about? Carmen whispered. I applied to both, Stanford for environmental engineering, and West Point for military engineering. I wanted to understand both sides of who I am before I made my choice. She looked directly at me. I wanted to meet my father and understand what military service really means before I decided whether to follow in his footsteps. The cafe suddenly felt too small, too quiet, too public for the magnitude of what Madison had just revealed. She hadn't just been seeking closure about her absent father, she had been conducting a kind of personal reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence about a path her mother had spent 18 years steering her away from. And now? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Madison smiled, and for the first time since I had seen her in the auditorium, she looked completely confident. Now I know exactly what I want to do. Carmen's coffee cup hit the table harder than intended, the ceramic sound cutting through the cafe's quiet atmosphere. West Point? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Madison, how could you, why didn't you tell us? The question hung in the air, and I could see 18 years of careful parenting decisions flashing across Carmen's face. Every conversation she'd had with Madison about college, every guidance counselor meeting, every discussion about career paths, all of it had been happening while our daughter was secretly considering the very life Carmen had worked so hard to steer her away from. I couldn't tell you, Mom, Madison said gently. You would have tried to talk me out of it, and I needed to make this decision based on facts, not fear. Robert leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his graying hair. Madison, applying to West Point isn't like applying to a regular college. There's a whole process, congressional nominations, medical exams, fitness tests. How did you manage all of that without us knowing? Madison's smile was almost apologetic. You'd be surprised how much you can accomplish when you're motivated. I got my nomination from Congressman Williams last fall. I told you I was staying after school for the environmental club, but I was actually training for the physical fitness test, and I scheduled my medical exam during that weekend. I said I was visiting Sarah at UC Davis. The methodical way she had orchestrated her deception was impressive and terrifying in equal measure. This wasn't a teenage rebellion or an impulsive decision. It was a carefully planned operation that demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking the military valued. But why? Carmen asked, and I could hear 23 years of protective instincts in those two words. Madison, you have a full scholarship to Stanford. You could become an environmental engineer, help solve climate change, make a real difference in the world without putting yourself in danger. Mom, Dad has been in the Army for over 20 years, and look at him, Madison said, gesturing toward me. He's sitting here in a coffee shop having a conversation with his family. He's not broken or traumatized or damaged. He's a person who chose to serve his country, and that service kept people safe. I felt a responsibility to interrupt. Madison, your mother has every right to be concerned. Military service isn't just about the person wearing the uniform, it affects entire families. You've seen what it did to us. No, Madison said firmly. I've seen what keeping secrets did to us. That's different. The distinction was subtle but significant, and it caught all three of us off guard. She was right. The damage to our family hadn't come from my military service itself, but from the way we had chosen to handle it. Carmen and I had made decisions based on worst-case scenarios and classified protocols, but we had never considered what the truth might have meant to Madison as she grew up. Tell me about West Point, I said, partly because I was genuinely curious, and partly because I could see Carmen needed a moment to process. What would you study there? Military engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure. Madison replied immediately. The Army Corps of Engineers is doing incredible work on renewable energy projects and environmental restoration. They're building solar farms on military bases, developing new water purification systems for disaster relief, creating sustainable housing solutions for refugee populations. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, and I could see the passion that had driven her to pursue this path secretly for months. This wasn't about following in my footsteps or rebelling against Carmen's wishes. It was about finding a way to combine her environmental interests with service to others. And after graduation? Robert asked, his voice carefully neutral. 5-year service commitment, as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers. I'd probably be stationed at bases around the country, working on infrastructure projects. Maybe deployed overseas for humanitarian missions, building schools, restoring water systems, that kind of thing. Carmen was shaking her head slowly. Madison, you're 18 years old. 5 years seems manageable now. But you have no idea how long that really is. You'd be 27 before you could make your own choices about where to live, what jobs to take, whether to start a family. Mom, I'd be making choices the whole time. They'd just be different choices than the ones I'd make at Stanford. The conversation was becoming circular, and I could see that we were approaching an impasse. Carmen's maternal instincts were warring with her respect for Madison's autonomy, while Robert was trying to navigate between supporting his wife and acknowledging his stepdaughter's right to make her own decisions. Can I ask you something, Madison? I said. When you contacted me 6 months ago, had you already applied to West Point? Yes, she admitted. I'd submitted my application in October. I contacted you in December when I found out I was being seriously considered. So, meeting me wasn't about getting to know your father, Carmen said, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. It was about research for a career decision. Madison reached across the table and took her mother's hand. It was both, Mom. I needed to understand who my father was as a person, but I also needed to understand what military service had meant to him, and I needed to know if he thought I was making the right choice. All eyes turned to me, and I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the second I had agreed to Principal Foster's public announcement. Everything that had happened today had been leading to this question. Would I encourage my daughter to follow the path that had cost me 23 years of her life? Before I answer that, I said slowly, I need to know something. Have you told West Point about me? Madison nodded. They know my father is active duty Army Special Operations. It actually helped my application. They like candidates with military family connections. And they know about the unusual circumstances of our family situation. I told them my parents were divorced when I was very young, and that I was raised primarily by my mother and stepfather. I didn't go into the classified details, but they understand that your work has required operational security. The fact that she had navigated these conversations successfully indicated a level of maturity and discretion that impressed me. She had managed to be truthful without compromising operational security, which suggested she already understood the complex balance that military families had to maintain. Madison, I said finally, I can't tell you what choice to make, but I can tell you that if you choose West Point, you'll be choosing a life that requires you to put service before personal desires, duty before convenience, and country before individual ambition. Some people thrive in that environment, and others find it suffocating. How do I know which kind of person I am? She asked. You already know, Robert said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. Madison, I've watched you for 15 years. When you were 8, you organized the neighborhood kids to clean up the park. When you were 12, you started a recycling program at school. When you were 16, you spent your summer vacation building houses with Habitat for Humanity instead of going to camp with your friends. He paused, looking at Carmen with an expression that seemed to ask for permission to continue. She nodded slightly. You've always been someone who sees problems and wants to fix them, who sees people in need and wants to help them. The question isn't whether you're suited for service. The question is whether you're suited for the specific kind of service the military provides. Madison smiled at Robert with genuine affection. So what do you think? Stanford or West Point? I think Robert said carefully that your mother and I raised you to make good decisions. And I think we have to trust that we did our job well enough that you'll make the right choice, even if it's not the choice we would make for you. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon progressed, and we were now one of only 2 occupied tables. The teenage barista was wiping down counters and occasionally glancing our way, probably wondering if we were ever going to leave, but none of us seemed ready to end this conversation, to go back to our separate lives and pretend that everything hadn't fundamentally changed. I've made my decision, Madison said finally. The silence that followed Madison's declaration stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Carmen's hands were clasped so tightly around her coffee cup that her knuckles had turned white. Robert sat perfectly still, his lawyer's training evident in his ability to wait for information rather than rushing to fill the quiet. And I found myself holding my breath, realizing that my daughter's next words would determine not just her future, but the entire trajectory of our newly reconnected family. I'm going to Stanford, Madison said, and the relief that washed over Carmen's face was immediate and visible. But before anyone could respond, Madison held up her hand. But not for the reasons you think. She turned to look directly at me. Dad, meeting you today, hearing you speak about the sacrifices you made, it helped me understand something important. You chose military service because you believed it was the best way to protect the people you loved. You stayed away from us because you thought that was what would keep us safe. I nodded, unsure where she was heading, but sensing that this conversation was about to take another unexpected turn. But here's what I realized during our phone call, 6 months ago, and what became even clearer today. The world doesn't need more people willing to sacrifice their families for their service. The world needs people who can find ways to serve while building strong families and communities. Carmen exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, but she was still listening intently. Environmental engineering at Stanford will let me work on climate change, sustainable energy, water conservation, all things that affect national security just as much as traditional military threats. But I'll be able to do that work while staying connected to the people I love, while building the kind of life that includes family dinners and birthday parties and graduation ceremonies where everyone important to me is actually present. The criticism was gentle but unmistakable, and I felt it land exactly where she intended. Madison wasn't rejecting military service out of fear or lack of patriotism. She was choosing a different kind of service, one that learned from the costs my choices had imposed on our family. Plus, she continued, her tone lightening slightly, I've already been accepted to both Stanford and West Point. I could always apply to the Army Corps of Engineers after graduation if I decide I want to combine environmental work with military service. But if I go to West Point now, I'd be committed to 5 years of service, whether or not it turns out to be the right fit. Robert smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. That's actually very strategic thinking. I learned from the best, Madison said, glancing between Carmen and Robert with obvious affection. You two taught me to think through decisions carefully, to consider long-term consequences, and to keep my options open when possible. Carmen wiped her eyes with her napkin, and I realized she had been crying quietly throughout Madison's explanation. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, not just for choosing Stanford, but for thinking through this decision so carefully, for considering everyone's feelings while still making the choice that's right for you. Actually, Madison said, there's one more thing. I want to defer to Stanford for a year. The emotional whiplash of the afternoon was becoming almost comical. Just when we thought we understood the situation, Madison introduced another completely unexpected element. Carmen looked like she was about to object, but Madison continued quickly. I want to spend the year getting to know Dad. Really getting to know him, not just having one conversation in a coffee shop and then going back to our separate lives. I want to understand what his work actually involves, what his life has been like, what he's learned that I could learn too. She looked at me with an expression that was both hopeful and determined. I know you're probably going to be deployed again, and I know there are things about your work you can't share, but I want to be part of your life in whatever way is possible. I've had 18 years with Mom and Robert, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. But I've had 0 years with you, and I think that's something we should fix. The proposal was so unexpected, so generous, and so complicated that I didn't know how to respond. A gap year with Madison would mean restructuring my entire life, finding ways to include her in a world that had been built specifically to exclude family connections. It would mean navigating Army regulations about dependent family members when she wasn't officially my dependent. It would mean figuring out how to be a father to an 18-year-old woman I barely knew. Madison, I said slowly, that's an incredible offer. But honey, my life isn't really set up for family visitors. I live on base when I'm stateside, and when I'm deployed, I'm often in places where civilian family members can't go. I know, she said. I've done my research. But there are Army bases with family housing, right? And there are support programs for military families, and when you're deployed, I could stay with Mom and Robert. Or maybe get an apartment near whatever base you're stationed at, and take community college classes. The level of planning she had already done was staggering. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment suggestion born from the emotion of our reunion. This was another carefully researched proposal from someone who had inherited both Carmen's analytical mind and apparently my strategic planning abilities. What does Stanford say about deferring? Robert asked, his practical nature asserting itself. They allow gap years for family circumstances, educational travel, or military service. I think getting to know my previously unknown father who's been serving in classified Army operations probably qualifies as family circumstances. Carmen was shaking her head, but not in disagreement. More like amazement. Madison, 6 months ago you were a normal high school senior worried about prom and graduation. Now you're orchestrating complex family reunions and gap year programs like you're running a small corporation. I had good teachers, Madison replied, smiling at her mother. Besides, this isn't that complicated. I will spend the next year learning about Dad's world, figure out whether military engineering is something I might want to pursue later, and then start Stanford in the fall of 2025 with a much better understanding of what I want to do with my life. She paused, looking around the table at each of us. Unless someone has objections. The question was clearly directed at Carmen, who had spent 18 years protecting Madison from exactly the kind of military life she was now proposing to explore. But Carmen surprised all of us with her response. Daniel, she said, addressing me directly for the first time since we'd sat down, would this work with your schedule, with your security clearances and deployment rotations? I considered the question carefully. It would require some adjustments, but yes, I think it could work. I'm due for a stateside assignment rotation anyway, and I have enough seniority now to request family-friendly postings. It wouldn't be easy, and there would definitely be times when she couldn't be around for security reasons. But, Carmen prompted, but I can't think of anything I'd want more than the chance to spend a year getting to know our daughter. The admission surprised me with its honesty. For 23 years I had told myself that staying away was the right choice, that protecting Madison from the dangers of my world was more important than being part of her daily life. But sitting in this cafe, looking at the remarkable young woman she had become, I realized that all of my noble justifications couldn't compete with the simple truth that I wanted to be her father. There's just one condition, Carmen said. And her tone was suddenly serious again. Madison, if you do this, if you spend a year in Dad's world, you have to promise me that you'll be honest about what you experience. If military life turns out to be harder than you expected, if you find yourself feeling isolated or stressed or unsafe, you have to tell us, and you have to promise that you'll still make your own choice about Stanford and your future, not what you think Dad wants or what you think I want. Madison nodded solemnly. I promise, Mom. This isn't about choosing sides or proving anything to anyone. It's about making sure I understand all my options before I commit to a path. The teenage barista appeared at our table with a polite but pointed suggestion that they would be closing soon. The afternoon had somehow turned into early evening while we sat there rebuilding 23 years of family relationships over coffee and life-altering revelations. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I realized that nothing about this day had gone according to plan. I had expected a brief, emotional reunion followed by a gradual process of getting to know Madison from a distance. Instead, I was facing the prospect of completely reorganizing my life to accommodate an 18-year-old daughter who was apparently as stubborn and strategic as both of her parents combined. "So what happens now?" Robert asked as we stood outside the cafe in the golden light of early evening. Madison grinned, and for the first time all day she looked like the teenager she actually was, rather than the young adult she was determined to become. "Now we figure out how to be a family." 3 months later, I stood in the hallway of a military housing unit at Fort Braxton, North Carolina, holding a set of keys and wondering if I had completely lost my mind. The two-bedroom apartment was standard military family housing, functional, clean, and utterly foreign to someone who had spent the last 2 decades living in barracks, bachelor officer quarters, and temporary deployment accommodations. Madison would arrive in 2 days, and I was discovering that preparing for an 18-year-old daughter was infinitely more complicated than preparing for a combat mission. What kind of food should I stock? Did she need her own bathroom? Would she expect me to know how to do laundry for civilian clothes? The questions seemed endless, and my usual military problem-solving approaches felt completely inadequate. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Madison's flight lands at 130C. She's nervous but excited. Thank you for doing this, Daniel." The simple message carried weight that went far beyond its words. In the 3 months since graduation, Carmen and I had navigated dozens of conversations about logistics, boundaries, and expectations. We had developed a cautious but functional co-parenting relationship that neither of us had ever expected to need. Carmen had been remarkably gracious about sharing Madison, especially considering that she was essentially handing over her daughter to a man she hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. The process of getting Madison cleared for life on a military base had been its own adventure. Army regulations weren't designed for situations where a soldier suddenly acquired an adult child who wanted to spend a gap year learning about military life. It had required paperwork, background checks, interviews with security personnel, and several conversations with my commanding officer that had been both professionally awkward and personally revealing. Colonel Patricia Washington, my CO, had been surprisingly supportive once she understood the situation. "Rodriguez," she had said after reviewing the request, "in 25 years of service, I've never seen anyone try to cram a lifetime of parenting into a single year while maintaining operational readiness. This is either going to be the best thing that ever happened to your family or a complete disaster. Any advice, ma'am?" I had asked. "Yes. Remember that being a father isn't the same as being a commanding officer. Your daughter doesn't need you to train her for combat. She needs you to teach her who you are as a person." The advice had seemed simple at the time, but implementing it was proving more challenging than expected. How do you explain 23 years of life experiences to someone who shares your DNA but not your history? How do you build a relationship with a young adult who's smart enough to see through any attempt at artificial bonding, but generous enough to give you the chance to try? I had requested and received an assignment to the base's Infrastructure Development Office, a position that would keep me stateside for the duration of Madison's gap year. It meant stepping back from the special operations assignments that had defined my career, but it also meant being available for soccer games, if Madison decided to join an intramural team, or college prep sessions, if she wanted help preparing for Stanford, or simply dinner conversations, if she wanted to understand what her father was actually like when he wasn't saving the world. The apartment came furnished with basic military-issue furniture, but I had spent the weekend trying to make it feel more like a home and less like temporary lodging. I had bought plants, assuming that someone interested in environmental engineering might appreciate greenery. I had stocked the kitchen with actual cooking supplies instead of just MREs and instant coffee. I had even purchased civilian clothes for myself, realizing that spending the year in uniform might not be the best way to help Madison see me as a person, rather than just a soldier. My biggest challenge had been setting up Madison's room. Military housing wasn't designed for teenage girls, and I had no idea what an 18-year-old woman might want in her living space. After several panicked phone calls to Carmen and a somewhat embarrassing shopping trip to Target, I had settled on neutral colors, good lighting, and enough space for Madison to personalize the room however she wanted. The doorbell rang at 1500 hours, 30 minutes earlier than expected. I opened it to find Madison standing in the hallway with two large suitcases, a backpack, and a grin that was equal parts excitement and apprehension. "Hi, Dad," she said, and the word still hit me like a small miracle every time she used it. "Madison, you're early," I said, immediately feeling stupid for stating the obvious. "My flight got in ahead of schedule, and the taxi driver knew a shortcut," she replied, looking past me into the apartment. "So this is home base, huh?" I stepped aside to let her in, watching as she took in the space with the same analytical attention she had brought to everything else about military life. She wandered through the living room, examining the furniture, the books I had arranged on shelves, the photographs I had finally unpacked after years of keeping them stored away. "You have pictures," she observed, stopping in front of a collection of frames on the mantel. "Some," I admitted. "Most of them were military photos, my unit in Afghanistan, a ceremony where I had received a commendation, a group shot from a training exercise in Germany, but there were also a few personal ones. My parents at their 40th wedding anniversary, my sister's family at Christmas, and one photo of Carmen and me from college that I had kept despite everything that happened afterward." Madison picked up the college photo, studying it with the same intensity she brought to everything else.
"You both look so young," she said.
"We were young. We thought we had everything figured out." "Did you love her?" Madison asked, and the directness of the question caught me off guard. "Very much," I said honestly. "I still do, in a way, not romantically. That ship sailed long ago, but I love who she became, how she raised you, the life she built for our family." Madison nodded and set the photo back down. "She still has pictures of you, you know, not displayed or anything. But she kept them. I found them when I was looking for documents for my college applications." The revelation was unexpectedly touching. Carmen had spent 18 years creating a narrative that essentially erased me from Madison's daily life, but she had preserved evidence of our relationship nonetheless. It suggested a complexity to her feelings that our recent conversations had only hinted at. "Are you hungry?" I asked, falling back on the universal parental response to not knowing what else to say. "Starving," Madison replied. "Airplane food is exactly as terrible as everyone says it is." I had planned to cook dinner, an ambitious menu that I had been practicing for weeks, but Madison had other ideas. "Can we order pizza and just talk?" she asked. "I want to hear about your life here, what you do all day, what it's like being you." 2 hours later, we were sitting on the living room floor with an empty pizza box between us, and I was explaining the organizational structure of Army Corps of Engineers, while Madison asked questions that demonstrated she had done significantly more research about military life than she had initially let on. "So when you were deployed to Afghanistan," she said, "you weren't just doing special operations stuff, you were also building infrastructure." "That's right. We'd secure an area, assess what the local population needed. Clean water, reliable electricity, road repairs, and then work with engineering units to design and implement solutions. That's exactly what I want to do," Madison said, her eyes lighting up with the same enthusiasm I had seen when she talked about Stanford. "Except I want to do it in places where people aren't shooting at the engineers." I laughed, recognizing my own pragmatic approach to problem solving in her comment. "That would definitely be an improvement, Dad," Madison said, and I could hear a shift in her tone that suggested we were moving into more serious territory. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay. Do you regret staying away?" "I mean, I understand why you did it, and I'm not angry about it anymore. But if you could go back and make the choice again, knowing how everything turned out, would you do it differently?" The question was one I had been asking myself for 3 months, ever since our reunion at graduation. It required me to weigh 23 years of military service against 23 years of missed fatherhood, to consider whether my contributions to national security justified the personal costs to our family. "Yes," I said finally. "I would do it differently. Not completely differently, I still believe in the importance of military service, and I'm proud of the work I've done. But I would have found ways to stay connected to you and your mother. I would have trusted both of you to handle the complexities of having a father in a dangerous job. Madison nodded thoughtfully. Good, because if you had said no, if you had insisted that staying away was the right choice, I would have had a hard time respecting the decisions you make now. The test was subtle but unmistakable, and I realized that Madison had been evaluating my character and judgment from the moment she walked through the door. She wasn't just spending a gap year getting to know her father, she was conducting an extended interview to determine whether I was worthy of a permanent place in her life. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" she asked, shifting back to lighter topics. "I thought I'd give you a tour of the base, introduce you to some of my colleagues, and show you what my daily routine looks like. And then maybe we could start talking about what you want to get out of this year." Madison grinned. "Actually, I already know what I want to get out of this year." "What's that?" "I want to understand why my mother fell in love with you 24 years ago, and I want to figure out if the man you've become is someone I'd choose as a father if I had the option." The honesty was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Madison wasn't just giving me a chance to be her father, she was giving me a chance to earn that role, and I had approximately 9 months to prove that I deserved it. 8 months into Madison's gap year, I was sitting in my office at Fort Braxton reviewing engineering reports when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Stanford University's admissions office, and my stomach immediately clenched. Madison's deferral period was almost over, and this call would likely determine whether my year as a full-time father was about to end. "Major Rodriguez, this is Dr. Jennifer Liu from Stanford's Environmental Engineering Department. I'm calling about Madison Rodriguez's enrollment status for the fall semester." "Yes, ma'am. Is there a problem with her registration?" "Quite the opposite, actually. Madison submitted her gap year reflection essay last week, and frankly, it's one of the most impressive pieces of writing we've seen from an incoming student. She detailed her experiences working with the Army Corps of Engineers on sustainable base infrastructure, her research project on water purification systems for disaster relief, and her observations about military families and community resilience. I had read drafts of Madison's essay, but hearing it described by a Stanford admissions officer gave me a different perspective on what my daughter had accomplished during our time together. She hadn't just been learning about my world. She had been conducting serious academic research while living it. "We'd like to offer Madison early admission to our accelerated bachelor's-master's program," Dr. Liu continued. "It's a 5-year track that would allow her to complete both her undergraduate degree and a master's in environmental engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure development." That's incredible," I managed. "Has Madison been informed? We wanted to speak with you first, actually." Her essay mentioned that her gap year had given her a new perspective on public service and family relationships. She wrote about learning from her father's dedication to duty while also learning about the importance of maintaining strong family connections. We were hoping you might provide some insight into her readiness for this accelerated program. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I had been a secret from Madison's life. Now Stanford University was asking for my assessment of her academic and personal development. The transformation felt surreal. "Dr. Liu, Madison is the most focused, determined, and intellectually curious person I've ever met. If she's interested in the accelerated program, she'll not only succeed in it, she'll probably redesign it to work better." Dr. Liu laughed. "That's consistent with our assessment. We'll be in touch with Madison directly about the program details. Thank you for your time, Major Rodriguez." After hanging up, I sat in my office thinking about how much had changed in less than a year. Madison had arrived at Fort Braxton as a brilliant but somewhat naive 18-year-old who thought she understood military life from movies and history books. She was leaving as someone who had lived in a military community, worked alongside Army engineers, attended family readiness group meetings, and experienced both the rewards and challenges of military service firsthand. More importantly, she had become my daughter in ways that went far beyond biology. We had developed inside jokes, established routines, navigated disagreements, and built the kind of relationship that could survive the normal stresses of family life. The gap year hadn't just been about Madison learning about my world, it had been about both of us learning how to be a family. That evening, Madison and I were preparing dinner together, a routine that had evolved from my initial attempts to cook for her into a collaborative effort that reflected our different strengths. She was better at planning meals and managing ingredients, while I had developed decent knife skills and could handle most of the actual cooking. Stanford called today, I mentioned while chopping vegetables for a stir-fry. Madison paused in her preparation of rice, but didn't look up. I know. Dr. Liu called me this afternoon about the accelerated program. And I told her I needed to discuss it with my family before making a decision. The casual way she referred to our family unit, which now included regular video calls with Carmen and Robert, and increasingly frequent visits, still caught me off guard sometimes. Madison had seamlessly integrated her biological father into her existing family structure without displacing anyone or creating artificial divisions. "What do you think about the program?" I asked. "I think it's an incredible opportunity," Madison said, finally looking at me. 5 years instead of 4. But I'd come out with a master's degree and probably some research experience that would set me up for either PhD programs or immediate entry into environmental consulting. But it would mean staying at Stanford for 5 consecutive years. No gap years, no study abroad, no time for internships or other experiences. I could hear the conflict in her voice, and I suspected I knew what was really bothering her. "Madison, are you worried about leaving me here?" She nodded, looking younger than she had in months. "We just figured out how to be father and daughter. I don't want to go back to being strangers." The fear was understandable, and it reflected something I had been thinking about for weeks. Our gap year experiment had worked beautifully, but it had worked because it was temporary and intensive. Now we needed to figure out how to maintain our relationship across distance, different schedules, and the normal challenges of adult life. "Sweetheart, what we built this year isn't going to disappear just because you're at Stanford instead of Fort Braxton. We've learned how to talk to each other, how to trust each other, how to be honest about what we need from this relationship. But what if you get deployed again? What if your schedule gets crazy and we lose touch? Then we'll figure it out," I said firmly. "Madison, one of the things this year has taught me is that being your father isn't something I do only when it's convenient or easy. It's who I am now, regardless of where either of us is living or what else is happening in our lives." Madison smiled, but I could see she wasn't entirely convinced. "What about you, though? What happens to your life here when I leave?" It was a question I had been avoiding for months, but it deserved an honest answer. "I'll probably request a transfer back to a more operational position. This year has been incredible, but it's also shown me that I'm not ready to retire from active duty. I want to keep doing the work I'm trained for. But now I'll be doing it as Madison Rodriguez's father, not as someone with no family connections." "That sounds lonely." "It won't be lonely because I'll have you. I'll have Carmen and Robert who have become genuine friends during this process. I'll have a family to come home to, even if home looks different than it does for other people." Over the next week, Madison wrestled with the Stanford decision while continuing her work on a research project about sustainable energy systems for military installations. She had become a fixture around the base engineering offices, asking questions that challenged conventional approaches and proposing solutions that impressed seasoned Army engineers. Colonel Washington had taken a particular interest in Madison's work, and she had mentioned several times that the Army needed more people who could think creatively about infrastructure challenges. It was clear that Madison could have a future in military engineering if she chose that path, but it was equally clear that she would thrive in civilian environmental work. On Friday evening, Madison made her decision. She accepted Stanford's accelerated program offer, but with a modification that she negotiated herself. She would spend her summers working on research projects with the Army Corps of Engineers, creating a formal partnership between Stanford's environmental engineering program and military infrastructure development. "So, I get the best of both worlds," she explained to Carmen and Robert during our weekly family video call. "I can pursue environmental engineering at one of the best programs in the country, But I also get to maintain connections to military engineering work and keep learning from Dad's world. Carmen looked relieved and proud in equal measure. Madison, that sounds perfect for you. And it means you'll have reasons to stay connected to both sides of your family. About that, Madison said, glancing at me with a mischievous expression I had learned to recognize over the past 8 months. I have one more announcement. Robert laughed. Should we be worried? I've been accepted to Stanford's summer research program, but I'm not starting until June. That means I have 3 months between finishing my gap year and starting college. What are you planning to do in 3 months? Carmen asked. I'm going to visit Mom and Robert for a month, help Mom with her garden renovation project, and spend time with the family I missed during my gap year. Then I'm going to spend a month traveling. I want to see some of the places Dad has been stationed, meet some of the people he's worked with, and understand more about his life before I came into it. She paused dramatically. And then I'm going to spend a month helping Dad move to his next assignment. I figure if I'm going to be an Army engineering consultant, I should understand what military family life really looks like from the inside. The plan was classic Madison, thorough, thoughtful, and designed to honor everyone important to her while advancing her own goals. It also reflected the confidence and independence she had developed during our year together. Madison, I said, that sounds like an excellent plan. But are you sure you want to spend your last month before college helping your old man navigate military bureaucracy? Dad, she replied, using the tone that meant she was about to say something important. A year ago, I thought having a father meant having someone who shared your DNA. Now I know it means having someone who shows up, who listens, who helps you figure out who you want to become. She looked directly at the camera, addressing all of us. You've all shown up for me in different ways. Mom and Robert gave me stability and love and the confidence to take risks. Dad gave me adventure and purpose and a new understanding of service. I'm not choosing between you. I'm choosing to build a life that includes all of you. 6 months later, I was standing in another graduation ceremony. This one Stanford's summer research program completion. Madison walked across the stage to accept recognition for her project on sustainable water systems for disaster relief operations, and this time, all of her family was in the audience. Carmen and Robert sat in the third row, beaming with pride. I sat beside them, no longer a secret or a stranger, but simply Madison's father. As Madison accepted her certificate and smiled toward our section of the auditorium, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Colonel Washington the week before. She had asked me if I regretted taking the gap year assignment, if the disruption to my career had been worth it. Ma'am, I had replied, I spent 23 years believing that being a good soldier meant sacrificing personal relationships. This year taught me that being a good soldier, and a good person, means figuring out how to honor both service and family. Madison found us after the ceremony, still wearing her cap and gown, and gave each of us the kind of hug that makes everything worthwhile. We were no longer a broken family held together by secrets and good intentions. We were something entirely new, a family that had learned to span distances, navigate complications, and create love where none had existed before. So, Madison said as we walked toward the parking lot together, anyone want to hear about my thesis proposal for next year? It's about sustainable military infrastructure design, and I'm going to need some expert consultant. Carmen laughed. Let me guess, you already have some people in mind for that consultation work. Madison grinned, looking exactly like the confident young woman she had become, and exactly like the little girl I had missed watching grow up. I might have a few ideas. And just like that, our family story continued. Not with a dramatic ending, but with the quiet certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.